Ella Clark slowly drifted back to consciousness, the steady beeping of machines pulling her from the depths of sedation. Her eyelids fluttered open, but the light in the hospital room seemed too bright, the sterile whiteness almost unbearable. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by something far more than just physical exhaustion. A fog clouded her mind as she tried to make sense of where she was and what had happened. She had been through surgeries before, 7 C-sections to be exact, so the sensation wasn't entirely new. But this time, something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. As she stirred in the hospital bed, Ella's first instinct was to move, to adjust her body and sit up. But when she tried, a terrifying realization hit her. She couldn't feel her legs. Panic surged through her like an electric current, forcing her heart to race. Her breath quickened as she tried again, desperately attempting to move her lower body. Nothing. There was no response, no sensation, nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness where her legs should have been. "Where are my legs?" The words tumbled out of her mouth in a hoarse whisper, her voice cracked and desperate. Her hand instinctively reached toward her legs, but the nurse who had just entered the room gently stopped her. "Ella," the nurse said, softly, her face a mask of calm professionalism, tinged with sorrow. "Please, let me explain what happened." Ella's pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at the nurse, her heart sinking. She didn't want to hear what the nurse had to say, but she knew she had no choice. "You had complications during your surgery," the nurse continued. "It was very serious. You lost a lot of blood. And despite everything we did, your legs, the blood flow was cut off for too long. We had to amputate them to save your life." "Amputate!" The word crashed into Ella like a tidal wave, sweeping her away in a torrent of disbelief and grief. Her mind refused to process the information. She had come to the hospital to deliver her baby, Winter Rose. It was supposed to be an emergency C-section. Complicated, yes, but nothing she hadn't faced before. This was her 8th child. She had survived 7 C-sections already. How could this one have ended in such horror? Her voice cracked again as she tried to comprehend the nurse's words. "My legs? They're gone?" The nurse nodded, her eyes filled with empathy. "I'm so sorry, Ella. We did everything we could, but this was the only way to save you." Ella felt like the walls were closing in around her. The room spun as the full weight of the situation settled over her. Her legs were gone. Her life, as she had known it, was over. The future she had imagined, one filled with laughter, family vacations, and raising her children, now seemed distant and unreachable. Tears streamed down her face, hot and uncontrollable, as the reality of her new life without legs began to take root in her heart. Just days before, Ella had been filled with a nervous excitement as she prepared for the birth of her 8th child. At 36 weeks pregnant, she had known the risks going into the hospital. She had been diagnosed with placenta previa, a condition in which the placenta partially covers the cervix, making a natural birth impossible and a C-section necessary. But Ella was no stranger to C-sections. Her first child, Ethan, had been born when she was just 18, and after a difficult natural birth, she had opted for C-sections for the rest of her pregnancies. Her husband, Ian, had been by her side throughout the pregnancy, offering reassurance and support. They had been through this process 7 times before, after all, and Ella felt confident. Despite the complications, she was optimistic. She had talked with Ian about their plans for the future, how they would raise their growing family, the vacations they wanted to take, and the joy of welcoming another baby into their lives. Winter Rose was meant to be the final piece of their family puzzle, the child who would complete their family of 10. When the time came for the surgery, Ella had entered the hospital with a sense of calm. The doctors and nurses were experienced, and she trusted them to bring her and her baby through the procedure safely. Ian was there, holding her hand as she was prepped for surgery, whispering words of encouragement. They had even talked about the family vacation they planned to take after Winter Rose was born, a way to celebrate their growing family and take a much-needed break from the whirlwind of raising 7 children. As Ella was wheeled into the operating room, she felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. She had done this before, But there was always that small flicker of fear that lingered in the back of her mind. The surgery began, and after 45 minutes, her daughter, Winter Rose, was born. Weighing 6 pounds and 5 ounces, she was placed on Ella's chest for a brief moment of skin-to-skin contact. Ella's heart swelled with joy as she held her newborn daughter, gazing into her tiny, perfect face. But that moment of joy was fleeting. Winter Rose was quickly taken away, and Ella sensed that something was wrong. The mood in the room shifted. The doctors and nurses moved with urgency, their faces tense. Ella's body felt cold, and a strange sensation washed over her, like she was slipping away. She heard a sound that would haunt her in the days to come, a rush of liquid, like water spilling onto the floor. Her vision blurred, and before she could fully understand what was happening, darkness swallowed her whole. For 5 days, Ella remained in a medically induced coma. The doctors had acted swiftly, performing an emergency hysterectomy to stop the bleeding caused by placenta accreta, a condition in which the placenta attaches too deeply to the uterine wall. The surgery had saved her life, but the damage to her legs had been irreversible. Due to a critical oversight, no one had checked the circulation to her legs for 6 crucial hours. By the time they realized what had happened, her legs had been deprived of blood for too long. The only option left to save her from septic shock was amputation. When she finally woke, it was to a life she hadn't chosen, a body that no longer felt like hers. The days that followed were a blur of physical pain and emotional torment. Ella's grief was all-consuming. She had gone into the hospital expecting to welcome her 8th child into the world, to bring her home to her 7 siblings and begin the next chapter of their lives. Instead, she was waking up to a nightmare she hadn't foreseen. How could she raise 8 children when she couldn't even stand? How could she be the mother they needed when her independence had been taken from her? Ian tried to be strong for her, but she could see the pain in his eyes. He had been the one to sign the papers authorizing the amputation, and although she knew he had done it to save her life, the resentment she felt was hard to ignore. They had been partners, equals, but now it felt like she was a burden. She couldn't help but wonder if Ian looked at her differently now, if he saw her as less of a woman, less of a wife. Their children, too, were struggling. Ethan, now 16, had always been her rock, the responsible older brother who helped with his younger siblings. But since her return from the hospital, he had become distant, retreating into his own world. He couldn't bring himself to look at her without flinching, as though her new reality was too much for him to bear. Lily, her eldest daughter, had always been a straight-A student, focused and determined. But now, her grades were slipping, and her teachers had expressed concern about her withdrawal from friends and activities. At 14, Lily was at a fragile age, and the sight of her mother in a wheelchair seemed to have shaken her to the core. She couldn't even look at Ella without a blanket covering her legs, as though seeing the truth of what had happened was too painful. The younger children didn't fully understand what had happened. To them, Mommy was still Mommy, but now she couldn't chase them around the yard or take them to the park. The things that had once been routine, playing games, cooking meals, running after the little ones, were now impossible. The house that had once been filled with laughter and activity now felt heavy with sadness and uncertainty. Winter Rose, the tiny miracle who had brought her both joy and pain, became Ella's anchor. Her newborn daughter was the only thing that kept her from completely falling into the abyss of despair. Holding Winter Rose in her arms gave Ella a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. But even that joy was tinged with sadness. She couldn't pace the floor with her baby in her arms, couldn't rock her to sleep while standing or walk with her outside. Every interaction with Winter Rose reminded Ella of what she had lost. Still, she fought. She fought to be the mother her children needed, even if she couldn't be the mother she once was. Every day was a battle against her own body, her own limitations, and the crushing weight of grief that threatened to swallow her whole. Some days, the pain was so overwhelming that all she could do was cry, her tears soaking into the pillow as Ian sat beside her, his hand resting gently on her back. He tried to comfort her, but there were no words that could ease the sorrow she felt. But there were also moments of strength, Moments when Ella found a glimmer of hope, a spark of resilience that refused to be extinguished. It started with small victories, learning to navigate the wheelchair, dressing herself without help, finding new ways to care for her children. These victories, though small, gave her the courage to keep moving forward. Months passed, and slowly, Ella began to adapt to her new reality. She learned to do things she had never imagined herself doing, like using prosthetics and adapting her home to accommodate her wheelchair. The physical challenges were immense, but they were nothing compared to the emotional toll. Her children's reactions, especially Ethan and Lily's, weighed heavily on her heart. But as time went on, they too began to adjust. Ethan, after months of silent withdrawal, finally approached her one evening. He hugged her tightly, his teenage bravado melting away as he whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't know how to handle this." Ella's heart swelled with relief. "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll get through this together." Lily, too, began to open up again. She no longer needed the blanket to cover her mother's legs, and her grades slowly improved. The family, though scarred, was beginning to heal. Ella's journey was far from over, but she had discovered something powerful within herself: resilience. Despite the unimaginable loss, despite the pain and grief, she had found a way to keep going. She had learned to live again, not just for herself, but for her family. Her legs were gone, but her spirit remained unbroken. In the end, Ella knew that life would never be the same. But as she looked at her children, at Ian, and at Winter Rose, she realized that while her body had been forever changed, her love for her family had not. She was still their mother, still their wife, still the woman who would fight for them every day of her life. And that, above all else, was what mattered most.